we're talking about the non-managing family shareholders. I want to make sure that we keep emphasizing that, but there has to be a way to give them a voice and allow them, some perspectives and understanding, give voice to the perspectives and the challenges that they have of being non-family, non-managing shareholders. So that, it's like, I don't own I don't have anything to do with XYZ stock. I'm not going to put any symbol out there, but just because I own the stock, I don't get any voting rights other than the shareholders vote. I can vote for the shareholders, but my little, stake in that company, regardless of, who that is tiny. But that's a natural, we all know those rules when we buy the stock. With a family business, it's much different than that, isn't it? And so the education process, and how do you give those people voice?
Well, it is, and I want to share an example about that was so touching to me in terms of the importance of that voice. And so, this was a family with multiple locations, all in small towns. And it was a family with multiple branches. So the third generation from the founder was running the business. And so in the process of starting the communication process, someone who was described by the people in the business as quite disengaged, when given the opportunity to talk about their experience, described the experience of being someone whose last name was the name of the business, but really knew virtually very little about the business. But because they operated in small towns, in his community, people would approach him on the street and say, "Hey, I heard about this," or "What's going on about that?" And he was profoundly embarrassed to not be able to communicate about what was going on in the business. And, it bothered him, but there was no vehicle to be able to voice that concern, right? And I'm not sure he even, verbalized it as a concern to himself until given the opportunity to talk about potential questions or information that he had. So, I think we underestimate the emotional connectivity and don't always anticipate where those emotional connectivities come from.
That's a great story. I appreciate you sharing both of the stories. It's this summer we did a family meeting, and it wasn't non-managing shareholders, but it was spouses and children of the family, family business members. So much the same thing. It was really interesting. We did, we put up a video of what the family does. We won't get into exactly, but it was, they're in the construction industry, and so it was just an interesting video that showcased the business. And one of the 9-year-old kids, just looked at the video, and she stands up and just looks at everybody and goes, "Who does this? It's so neat." And it was just that same kind of concept of sharing that. So Arne, talk about, what are some of the ways that we can provide, give that voice to those non-managing shareholders and tackle some of these challenges?
Yeah, absolutely. I think one of the key ones is really around having some structure or process that really sincerely conveys that we recognize you benefit from education. We recognize your importance as supporters of the business, right? So family meetings are a really important one. With the example that I shared a little bit ago, those 3 siblings, G2, the ones all in their 60s, the senior generation, they recognized that they needed to do a better job of engaging non-managing shareholders through a family meeting structure, not the once a year vacation-based, family vacation-based sort of family reunion structure that they had done for 20 years since their own parents were alive, where there was a little bit of information shared, but it was really a family reunion. But to actually have more regular family meetings. And so that was a huge undertaking for them. Among the siblings, there was not uniform agreement around how often they should do those meetings, how much information should be shared, or even why those non-managing shareholders deserved to have, 4 or 5 times a year family meetings. The other piece was then, what do you share at those meetings, right? And I think one of the key learnings there, Michael, for me, was that some of the sibling owner group, they were worried that somehow inviting those non-managing shareholders to a family meeting conveyed that they would have voting rights around the strategy of the business. And so, again, another really key communication aspect, both for the managing family member and the non-managing shareholder family member, around what are your rights and responsibilities as shareholders, and where do your rights and responsibilities end, and those who are managing the business, which in this case is feeding into those trusts that you will benefit from someday, where do they have the voting rights that you don't have? But what was in between, of course, is everyone's right to communicate better, educate better, understand better. And I think there was some recognition in that senior generation that, in fact, the closer you drew those non-managing family members in, the more likely you were to get that support you needed around how you run the business.
That's interesting. It's almost like what we fear most is when you dive into it directly is when you get the best results.
Mm-hmm.
Exactly.
Love that. Pat, anything you'd like to add?
Well, just building on that, in the example that I shared about the families kind of coming together regarding how they would communicate. One of the things that that it's important to think about is sharing information from the perspective of the recipient. So with this particular family, as Arne, referenced, there was a practice of annual meetings and information was shared, but prepared by the CFO, prepared in a way that that didn't really ask the question, is this what you want to hear? Is this what you're interested in? Is this the level of detail? So being able to drill into what is of interest to you, what would be helpful, and frame those discussions in a user-friendly way, is important. In your example, the video of what we do, right? If you want to think about engaging, the teenagers, the younger folks, one of the things that's exciting about family business is the contribution that's made, the profound contribution in the country, around the world, of family business, and the cool stuff that people do that family members are often sort of tangentially aware of. But when you really drill down into what it is that we do and what's important, that can be very engaging and builds a kind of pride that is invaluable in terms of long-term engagement. I think Arne raised a really important point about the issue of the fear around, well, are you going to try to tell me what to do? And so I think at the heart of that is that when you have shareholders who are owners, literally, who see themselves as owners, what does that ownership mean? Does it mean I can tell you what to do? Well, no. But what it does mean is that you have the right to understand the key drivers of the business and how those are going. So taking another example of a sibling group who, one of whom ran the business, lost their parents suddenly. And even though the sibling who was running the business had been cultivated in that role by the father, the sudden loss put the siblings into an interesting position, because all of a sudden the middle kid, right, was in control of what they now all had equal shares in. And so they were making each other crazy with questions about, well, what about this and what about that? And the managing, sibling was feeling like, unduly questioned and, potentially undermined. And so just the process of helping them step back to say, what are the key variables that influence your interest in this business? And things like, this happened to be kind of commercial real estate. So things like occupancy, things like debt load on some of the properties, a process of going through and figuring out the key drivers that they really did have a right to know, and communicating that information in a proactive way, um, uh, put some structure around that constant questioning. Because if you ask the other siblings, they would say, well, we feel like we're responsible now and we have to ask questions and we need to know. But it was not organized in a way that was helpful to anyone. And so, thinking about the drivers of the business and how that's relevant to shareholders is a valuable activity.